Okay, so we're just recapping, right, in the Pachad Yitzchok in the first Ma'amar. So the concept that I'm just going to remind everybody from the Gra that we mentioned, that we're building on, is that when you are taking the Isur, right, you are forbidden from taking something from one domain to the other on Shabbos, and it has a bare minimum requirement. And when you take something from one domain to another that doesn't have, that it's not big enough to make you liable, I'm taking a piece of food from my house to shul, and in and of itself, it's not the size that I'd be liable for, but I'm taking it in a vessel. The vessel is certainly big enough. If I had taken the vessel, just let's say I wanted to take this container to shul, and there's no eruv. So if I would take the container, because I want the container by itself, so that act of me taking the container, I intended to take a container to shul, I took the container's big enough, I'm liable. But let's say that same container, I put food in it, and the food is not enough. And it's the food that I want in shul. I don't care about the container. If the container is totally, it could be in this or a plastic bag or whatever, it's totally incidental. So even though it is of the size, since it was incidental to the food, and the food is what I wanted to take, I am not liable because the food wasn't enough, and it's as if the food, which is my main, that's what I want to take, invalidates the presence of the vessel and makes it as if the vessel wasn't there. Right. That's what we call ikar and tafel, a primary and a secondary. Meaning the ikar, the main intent, the reason my intent was for this object, and that object, right, basically negates the presence of the other object. Okay, so now the Gra wants to say that this idea is basically a central theme in the spirituality of Shabbos, and he wants to say that there is a reality that's happening during the 6 days of the week, in the creation of the week, in the story of Bereshit, and then there's something that happens on Shabbos, and that thing that happens on Shabbos reveals that the constant that we were aware of during the week, which we took for granted as being the essential, now is made to be the secondary, right, in light of the revelation of the essential dimension that's being revealed on Shabbos. Right. There's something about Shabbos that until now the status quo reality was a certain way, but Shabbos kind of upends that and turns that into something completely secondary to the new reality emerging on Shabbos.
It's a kli until you put the food in it. And when you put food in it, it's Shabbat.
Meaning it's itself an object till Shabbat puts the food in it, right, and then it becomes a kli.
Right.
Okay? So that was a concept. So and the Gra took that even further. He said that there's something going on when it says that God abstained mikol melachto, from all his work. What does that mean? It means that the truth is that what God did on the 6 days, during the 6 days, that was a one-time thing because it was the first time. But everything that he does during the 6 days, all the ma'amarim that he says, he actually maintains them actively, consciously, subsequently in existence. So for example, every single day of Yom Rishon is being generated again as a Yom Rishon. God didn't just make a Yom Rishon one time and say from now on there's going to be a phenomenon called Yom Rishon, but he actually, right now he's making Yom Rishon. What he did during the first week was he invented it, but now he's actualizing it consciously. Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi, etc. However, Shabbat, he doesn't do that. On Shabbat, on the subsequent Shabbat, after the first Shabbat, Hashem is not generating Shabbos spontaneously on Shabbos, but on Friday, he makes provision for Shabbos. Okay? Okay, so the Gra wants to say that what does God abstain from on Shabbos? The reoccurring act of creation subsequent to the first week, that's what he abstains from on Shabbos. And we said how what happens on Shabbos is emerges that those creative, those dimensions of reality that are being created during the week, they can only be appreciated in and of themselves during the week. But then we realize on Shabbos there is the spirit, the soul of the whole reason of vitality that those creations have even is being revealed. And then we see that they are not really the creation, but just creations to facilitate true creation. I mean, there's something about Shabbat that's revealed, the connection of Shabbat, the goal of the Bria, and the inner vitality that emerges, the spirituality that becomes present, that we don't see, that's always present, but it's invisible until now, and that kind of puts the creation of the 6 days into a perspective. Okay, Where are we? We're on Hey. Aval Harei, Kol Kviut Mishkal Ha'arachin Shel Ikar V'Tafel, all the various weighings and estimates of this idea of an essential and a secondary, the relationship between the main essential part of it and all the things, all the features around it that are just meant to facilitate it. Okay, so it's impossible to apprehend and ascertain the makeup of the Ikar and the Tafel just through dat, through knowledge. I'm sorry, the only way is through dat. Meaning the only feature, if you have one kind of tool at your disposal that's meant to ascertain the relationships between what is essential and what is secondary, that is the dat. So if Shabbat reveals, it is a revelation, it makes with stark clarity, it presents what is tafel and what is ikar, that means that there is this great hara of dat. Shabbos is a great revelation of the discernment of a human being. Okay, rak hadat, only knowledge, hi hashokelet u'maricha, it's only facility that can, or faculty rather, that can measure and assign value. Mitzad kol kochot haguf, from the side of all the different physical abilities of a person, v'hanefesh, and his spiritual abilities, his more ethereal abilities. Ein makom klal la'avchana bein ikar v'tafel. All those faculties at a human's disposal do not give him the ability to discern between what is essential and what is non-essential. Kirak kviut archo shel eze inyan yesh baha'ala l'madrigot ikar v'harada l'madrigat tafel. It is only through the establishment, the assigning of the value of something that creates the importance of elevates something to become a certain meaning. The relative value of something is being projected on by the observer.
Right.
It's vis-a-vis. Right, the implications are in your world. So
because physically it's the same thing.
Exactly, nothing's changed. It's the assignment of value, and that's in terms of relationship, right? So when you only have one side of the equation, it is what it is. All of a sudden, another element appears. There's a relationship. So what is the relationship between these two aspects of this thing? Okay, so the observer, right. So meaning, what gave a vessel's just a vessel and a food's just a food. The importance of the thing is assigned by your relationship to it. Okay? And that's what your dat is. It's funny because we use dat to mean not just what you're receiving from existence, your understanding, but also what you're asserting. Right. It's my dat. Since it was my dat was on the piece of food. That's what's important to me. That renders the physical vessel, right? It gives it cosmically a value of new. Right. Okay. Umimela. Hi mafkiato al yedei kach. And therefore, your dat, in the case with the food and the vessel, that's what removes, right, the act, when you took it from one domain to the other, from a concept of intended malacha on Shabbos, that what you intended, meaning there was no intention specifically on the vessel. Now, when we say no intention, we don't mean a lack of conscious intention, but we mean what your intent was, what your desire. And to the point where it undermines the act as a constructive, thoughtful act, to the point where there is absolutely no denial of resting on Shabbos. The faculty of dat, lo nivra, was only created ki and biyom hashishi l'masa bereshit. When does dat appear in creation?
With Adam.
With Adam on the sixth day.
Although you could argue that Hashem had the dat.
Yeah. Well, okay, it's important to note here that the coordinate of dat in the story of Bereshit is a function of two things. You could say that the appearance of dat here is a function of the appearance of man. Man was created on the sixth day. Man brings dat to the table. Right. But until now, we didn't mention that. We're saying what was created dat. Dat, the line of demarcation between Shabbat and the week, is what created dat. Right? Meaning the sixth day on the right is the end of, on the sixth day, perhaps, we're saying that there was a moment of a culmination of the 6 days of creation, that reality, and now the emergence of Shabbos. So once you have one thing to contrast to the other, you have the ability for dat. But he's not saying that. I believe what he's saying is you could not appreciate the contrast without dat, and dat was introduced on the 6th day with the creation of man. And Shlomo's asking, dat is not a function of man, dat is a function of knowledge which comes from God. But it's not God's dat that's projected on reality that gives it meaning.
Wait.
Meaning God's dat does not function that way.
It's not God's dat?
Meaning the dat that we're talking about has to be man's dat.
Why?
Because God does not determine, God just determines that the molecules will arrange themselves as a physical vessel or as food. It's up to you to determine what's important to you. The dat of the observer here, which is what makes the story, is not the dat of God, it's the dat of man. God always was aware of the Shabbos inherent in creation, even before Shabbos occurs. He knows what's tafel and ikar. But in creation, that's not manifest till the observer sees it. I mean, God knows what he's doing from the first moment. He knows that there's going to be a Shabbat later on. I mean, he knows what the tafel and the ikar is in a way that it doesn't make the tafel and ikar. It doesn't matter. Meaning, he's the one setting everything up. What gives it that extra level now is what creation is experiencing. Right? Was there a change for God between Yom Shishi and Yom Shabbos? Was there an invention of something on Shabbos that wasn't, meaning, even if it came into being, he was thinking about it. There's no change in God's awareness of anything. That doesn't.
But you're suggesting that the perception of the observer of man is more important in the act of creation than the perception of God as the creator.
I'm saying that God, that in a way, I would say it a little differently. This new element of dat is what God is an ingredient that God puts in creation. Now, that's what gives creation purpose and meaning. It's not his dat. Meaning God always had that intention. He knows exactly what's going on, and that still doesn't bring dat to the table. That doesn't make it. That doesn't activate this level of dat within reality. Dat within reality, for the Bria to be aware of itself, for the Bria to have this, for this to be real within Bria. I mean, God's dat is outside of Bria. For dat in Bria is man's dat. Okay, we can come back to this. This is interesting. Okay? Because I didn't think about this before. I did not intentionally, like in my mind, I was not aware that there would be some sort of chakira between. But we're meaning here he's saying that dat appears on the 6th day, and you're asking dat should have appeared on the first day when it says vayavdil.
Right.
Because imein dat havdal minayin. Where do you see? That's exactly what we're saying here, by the way. Dat. Where do you see dat in action? Dat is the ability to discern. All discernment is a function of dat. The more knowledge you have of the world, right? The more intimately involved, the more finer distinctions you can make, right?
Yeah, it's just fascinating to me to put all that weight on man.
Okay, here, let's say, you're an expert on wine. You've cultivated wine, you have appreciation for wine, you know all about the process, you have a very developed palate, and you've had experience to taste all different kinds of qualities of wines over your lifetime. And let's say you have a contemporary, you have a friend who in theory could have done all that, but hasn't. And you sit down for a nice bottle of wine. Your experience is going to be completely different than his, because for him it's just a bottle of wine and he's tasting all these things for the first time. He doesn't even know how to give words to whatever subtle experiences that you're like, that note from this, and you're comparing it to this. So there is infinite amounts of appreciation you can have because you're discerning and contrasting it, right, in your experience from all those other bottles, right? So first we're going to say the more dat you have, the experience and engagement you've had with wine, the more you're able to appreciate this particular bottle, contrast it to your friend who has meaning, right?
I think the problem I have with it is this, that because the real ultimate dat is the dat of justice. And
where do you get that? Where's that from?
Because you want to understand what is just and what's not just.
Where do we ever use dat in terms of justice?
I'm just suggesting that that's the ultimate form of that.
Well,
is discerning between what is right and what is wrong. Isn't that what dat is?
I don't believe so. No. Dat is not an abstract sense of morality. Dat is used, pretty much the only way I know how it's used is dat Hashem, knowledge of God. And that means intimacy. It doesn't mean information. That means that you are a product of your connection with God. In all ways.
But the highest manifestation of God's presence is His justice, surely. There's no higher manifestation.
I hope not. That's pretty sad because that would negate the need for Dat Hashem la'atid lavo, when there's no need for justice. I don't know if that's really the goal. It's super important what you're saying.
I'm not saying
and
it's the
in a
goal.
world,
I'm saying that's the ultimate expression of it. It's not the goal.
I don't think so. I think the highest expression of Dat Hashem is Nivuah. And that really, you don't see, meaning the implications of that. You know, you want a society that manifests God and knows God, and in its culture, it's a representation of the truest justice and all the values, you know, and midot that we say are godly, like you're saying. But I wouldn't put that as the bar and the ultimate definition of a terminology that we use when we talk about dat. I don't think dat is used that way. Dat is an intimacy with the Ribbon Shalom. And it's not specifically in justice, meaning in terms of how justice is met, that's a realm of reality that has to manifest godliness too. But there's no difference between, let's say, the justice of the knowing of God and the love of knowing God. And justice is also just gvurot.
But we just learned before that we just learned before in Pachad Yitzchok, don't let your human inquiry determine what's right and wrong. But you're saying human inquiry is going to determine what is primary and what's secondary.
No, we're not talking about inquiry here. That's not what dat is.
But isn't that what...
You're using seicha. The word seicha is the word dat. Listen, if I ask you what the word knowledge means, in English, what is the word knowledge?
Knowledge is fact.
What do you know? If I say, what do you know? The person who just told me, Shlomo just said, knowledge is facts. So Shlomo's going to close his eyes for a second and think about all the information that he has in his head and arrange them like an encyclopedia, the facts. Right? That's not what knowledge means. And that's not how we use it here. Knowledge, meaning you think that knowledge are the things about the world that you can put in your head and walk away. Right. No, we don't believe in that. We believe true knowledge is the ability that your mind has now to connect to a reality outside of you. Knowledge means connection. What you know is not the facts, abstractions, and thoughts in your head. What you know is your being. When I wake you up in the middle of the night and I ask you what your name is, right? It's not the fact that you know in a particular language with certain glyphs that your name looks like. It's like who you are. Knowledge is the sum of what you've made, what you know, how you're interfacing with the reality and how you're interpreting that reality. That's your dat. And the more your dat is clear and made up of a connection with God without things in there that are off, then you have true dat. So dat means an intimacy, a connection. Your whole living and being is manifest as a result of your connection with God. Dat is always used biblically for physical, for sexual intimacy. In Bereshit. I didn't talk about that before in our last piece, but that's what dat means. And why do we call it dat? Exactly for everything we were talking about. Dat is about integration, connection, and unity in an intimate, real way. And that's, when we talk about sexuality, that's what it was supposed to be. So when we're talking about dat here, so going back to the wine, right? So we say, Chazal saying, Ein dat havdala minayin. Without dat, you cannot discern. So one of the ways we understanding dat here is that your ability to discern, the more intimately involved you are, that you are made up of the experiences that you have and what you've learned from the world and how you've been shaped by that, right? That determines how you interface with it. So the more ability I have, the intimacy I have with a particular aspect of creation, the more I can discern in that aspect. So somebody who's experienced a lot of wine and has the facility to discern, he has more dat about wine. Okay, so now going back to our issue about the dat of reality within creation, is it Hashem's dat or our dat? Now, is there any difference to God who made all the wine? He knows in the potential of every wine that he made, all the different appreciations that all the different people could have. But what makes that an experience is totally unique and subjective.
Right.
So God's dat, he's not interested in creating necessarily he's putting the potential into existence, right? He knows when he does Sheshes Yimei Bereshis that there's going to be a neshama yisera with the presence of Shabbos. That's not going to, for him, he knows already, he's planning it all out, he's doing it. The dat, his dat doesn't change what it is.
Right.
It's the dat that occurs within creation when man wakes up that makes it significant. Because remember, that whole aspect of creation is super important. The relationship between God, who's doing it all, but really.
So you're suggesting that without man, there's no Shabbat.
Okay, so that's an interesting point. Before that, let's take a step back and make it even. Let's say there's a beautiful sunset. It's only beautiful because you can imagine what it would have been like if you saw it. But let's say there was nobody there. There was a sunset. There was a beautiful cliff, and there was nice clouds, and the colors were amazing, but nobody was there. Was it a beautiful sunset?
Yes.
Because you're imagining it. But
because in reality, it was a beautiful sunset.
God makes the sun set. Why does he bother making it beautiful? Why is it that, the diffusion of the light and the molecules and whatever it is, it creates some sort of aesthetic, pleasurable experience that's hardwired into us, that gives us some sort of sensual pleasure and a sense of majestic grand. What is that? Meaning, it has to do mechanically. It has to mechanically do what it does anyway. Yeah. Why did Hashem throw in that it should be so significant to you as an aesthetic experience?
It's like why food should be tasty.
So I would argue that it would not be beautiful if you weren't there to observe it. Right. I mean, now that human beings can appreciate it, so even if there's no human being geographically there at a particular night, it's beautiful. But if there was no human being to ever be created, it would not be beautiful, right? The whole partnership of creation that makes it significant on that level was built in. I mean, God says whatever needs to be done in order for it to be done, it's being done, but it's all being done for you because here's the thing, the objective mechanics of existence in and of themselves do not have meaning. When the observer connects to them and relates to them, and he has da'at of them, and it affects his sense of self, that's what gives it meaning. So the meaning of creation, by definition, is being given by man. By man's presence. That's why God put the man in the thing. He made the thing just for man, right? Let's have a party with man. I'll make this whole thing, and I'll leave the significance of meaning of creation to be generated by your experience. That's really what's going on, right? So that's a function of our da'at. If you want to talk about the corollary of da'at, God has got. It's weird to talk about da'at of God, because God, the ability to discern from the outside in things that are. What do you mean? He made everything from the top down. It's already, his da'at is being built into it, right? So da'at of Hashem is the intimacy and connection that we could have with Hashem within this world.
But you will still end up with the conclusion that Shabbat exists only because man exists.
So now, let's go back to that point. So it says, we say that the Kedusha of Shabbos is different than the Kedusha of Yamim Tovim. Because we say, Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh HaShabbat. And on Yom Tov we say, Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Yisrael V'Hazmanim Mekadesh Yisrael V'Rashei Chadashim. Because the sanctity of time is a function of the sanctity that God invested in man.
Right.
God made Am Yisrael Kadosh and said, you have the power over time. Right. But Shabbos is independent because Shabbos was sanctified before anybody else did, and It's built into, right. So Shlomo's asking a good question. You're saying, how can you tell me? It sounds like you're saying that Shabbos is a function of Das, that appears, that's what man brings to the table. Mm-hmm. I think it's like this. In Shabbos, there's the need that it needs to be shared in order for it to have significance. I mean, we didn't get there yet, but in the idea that, what does it mean that God kept Shabbos, and why do we keep Shabbos? So I would say that we keep Shabbos to say that we rest on the same day that God rests, to say that God rested specifically for us. Meaning, the fact that God rested on Shabbos is relevant to us. We share with that. He did that for us, and that's why. Meaning there's some sort of covenant about Shabbos that is immediately significant to us, and that's why we're marking it. What is that? That God intended in the Bria to have a partner with humanity. So Hashem drew a line at some point of his involvement in the world, meaning he said, I'm doing a creative act to put a whole bunch of potential on the table to set up, and then I want you to bring it to completion, so I'm drawing a line in terms of my involvement, so from this line and on, there's space for you. Meaning it's inherent in the creation that God said he put a limit to how he's involved in order that man should take it further. Okay, so already in the Shabbos that Hashem put, it was intended for man to complete, for the das to pick up. So I think even in Shabbos, even what we're saying, it's true that Shabbos is reliant It's true that Hashem put Shabbos in, but it was all dependent on man to pick up the thing and celebrate Shabbos. What's the point of a creation that Hashem has a Shabbos? Right. He's waiting to give it to people, and people don't. Then there's, so that's how I would. Okay. Okay. So on the sixth day we have the creation of man, and that introduces this whole idea of koach hadat. Hu ma'amar shel na'aseh adam. So a fair way to say the introduction of the creation of man in Shesh Yemei Bereshit is the creation of dat, which is really the sixth midah, which is Keneged Yom Shishi, which is Yisod.
That's interesting.
Okay? Which is also sexuality.
Right.
Dat, Yisod, okay. Sha'arei ad shelo ba'adam lo hayta ba'olam bria ba'alat koach hadat. Straight out. V'chozrim anu l'divrei hagra, ki chidush ma'aseh bereshit b'Shabbos huchan me'erev Shabbos. So it turns out that what happens, we're returning to the words of the Gra because the chidush, the novelty in ma'aseh bereshit on Shabbos, meaning the ability to, we said that Hashem is regenerating creation all the time, so that on Yom Rishon, after the first week, Hashem is actively manifesting Yom Rishon, etc., except for Shabbos. Every Shabbos was made on Friday. Okay? Kilomar, Kimoshe kol tzarchei Shabbat. Just like all the needs, the essentials for Shabbat, muchanim hey me'erev Shabbat, need to be prepared on the eve before Shabbos. Kimo kein, so too, huchan be'erev Shabbat. What was prepared on Erev Shabbat, on Erev Shabbat Bereshit, was oto hakoach, that same ability, hamavchin ben ikar v'tafel, the ability to discern between that which is an element, which is essential, and all those features around it which are just meant to facilitate. That which is secondary, that ability to discern was that which emerged on the sixth day. Asher mitucha shall have chana zo, that from within this discernment, efshar lo, it is possible, l'chidush ma'aseh bereshit, to renew the creative act of Bereshit, b'chol rega, in every moment, afilu b'yitzuma shel yom hashvita, even on the day, and smack in the middle of the day of Shabbos, v'dok hetev, and you think about this well. Okay, so he's reiterating here the yesod that we reviewed. Yeah, and we want to get somewhere, but we're going to have to pause here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Koach.